broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the seminar, Cyberbullying Prevention in the Screen Age. It Takes a Village. Hello, I'm Karen McKelvey. I'm PSI's webinar coordinator. And we are here with this topic to let you know that there are estimates that teenagers spend about 6 hours or more a day on their technology devices. Unfortunately, technology today provides the perfect forum for relational bullying. The anonymity of technology results in messaging that is nasty and humiliating and often has content that young people would never have said in person or face-to-face. Schools have been uncertain how to respond to this cyberbullying and have thought, since it occurred away from school, that it was not their problem. However, as all of you know, it almost always impacts learning and the environments at schools. School personnel have described responding to cyberbullying as a slippery slope and very time-consuming. This webinar will provide an overview of cyberbullying and also discuss how it is intertwined with regular bullying and outline important steps for teaching digital citizenship and how parents can provide closer supervision of their children's technology. Our presenter, Scott Poland, is a PSI expert partner and one of the premier experts on school safety and suicide prevention. He has been invited to testify before the U.S. Congress on 4 occasions and has also authored 5 books and numerous chapters and articles about school safety, youth violence, and suicide prevention. He has previously been the president of the National Association of School Psychologists and also directed psychological services for 24 years for Cypress Fairbanks Independent School District in Houston, Texas. Currently, he is psychology faculty and the co-director of the Suicide and Violence Prevention Office at Nova Southeastern University in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. During this presentation, the audience will be electronically muted. If you have questions, use the question and answer function there on the right, much like an instant message. Submit your questions by typing them, and we will cover as many of them as possible in the time allotted. We are also recording this presentation for those who couldn't register or attend the live broadcast. PSI's contact information will also be on the last slide. And now, on behalf of all of us at PSI, we are so pleased to present Dr. Scott Poland. Scott?
Thank you very much, Karen. And indeed, it's my pleasure to have a chance to talk with all of you today. Thank you for your valuable time. Hope to say some things that'll be helpful and meaningful to all of you. The last People magazine that I received only a week ago. Here's the headline story. Stop the bullying. A teen suicide. Cruel and relentless cyberbullying drove 16-year-old David Molak to take his own life. Now his family is working to change laws and save lives. We do know that the consequences of bullying and cyberbullying can be extremely difficult for young people. We know that the impact of being the victim of bullying may last for as long as a decade. The good news, thankfully, is that the majority of young people that are the victim of bullying do not attempt or die by suicide. And to be honest with you, the newspaper and People magazine headlines have really oversimplified. But there are so many important things that we need to be doing in our schools and communities, and it certainly does take a village. The village will include the parents, students themselves, teachers, administrators, community workers that are in programs that are after school, or Sunday school teachers are on in the workplace where we supervise young people. Everybody needs to be alert. And bullying is not just for the schools to solve. It actually does, in fact, take everyone. And let's look at the reality of bullying. And I think most of you know that it tends to peak at the middle school ages, or what we call middle childhood. Many of you know that cyberbullying sort of has taken a different form that so many of us that are older did not have to deal with. In fact, let me be honest, when I grew up and I went into my house after school, it was a safe haven. Nobody could reach me. I mean, yes, they could have called, but do any of you remember living in a house where there was one telephone and there was actually a cord on that phone? And I swear to you, my mom sat next to that phone my entire adolescence. They couldn't reach me unless they wanted to talk to my mom first. Today, unfortunately, it can be 24/7. And sometimes there's some definition issues. Someone will say, well, by definition, bullying is repetitive. It's nasty, it's humiliating, but it has to happen time after time to meet that definition. But I might argue, well, wait a minute. Only one thing was posted online. However, 48 kids quickly agreed with that humiliating posting. So we do have to realize the power of the cyberbullying in terms of once that content is out there, it can be continual and it's very difficult to ever remove or erase it. Now, how about this last point that's here? Only 1/3 of the bullying victims told an adult. So the obvious question is, why don't they tell us? And they're going to say something like this. I didn't think the adults could do anything about it. I thought if I told the adult, I told the teacher, I told the assistant principal, or I told my dad, things would only get worse, and the adults do not have the ability to stop it. So how do we get them to come forward? And if I can emphasize one thing, it would be this. When we know a kid is a victim of bullying, we need to make clear, this is not your fault. You do not deserve this. You are not bringing this upon yourself. And I'm going to be there with you every step of the way to get this stopped. And you know, when I worked in the schools all those years, as Karen mentioned, I would get referred as a psychologist, kids that were the victims of bullying. And a lot of that bullying was taking place on school grounds. And I would often ask, did you tell your teacher? And usually they would say, at least about 1/3 of the time, if not more, they would say, yes, I told her. Well, what did she say to you? She told me just stay away from those boys. Don't let that bother you. And instead, we have to roll up our sleeves, get in there, consequences for the bully, and support for the victim. And more about that as we move through today. I'm curious, how many of you have ever heard of common sense media? Because to be honest, I had not until about a year ago when I started developing a workshop for PSI on 13 Reasons Why. And if you're familiar with that popular Netflix program, it had so many unsafe messages. And it implied, unfortunately, suicide is a logical outcome to being bullied. And that is not the case. As I stated in the beginning, thankfully, most kids do not attempt or die by suicide, but it certainly causes them a lot of anxiety, frustration, anger, and a lot of feelings of low self-worth. But Common Sense Media is an excellent resource for schools and parents. Pretty much they rate everything in terms of television programs and movies and letting the adults know what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. But they provide this data about teenagers online almost constantly. 24% of teens. One of them just last week said, I just can't put it down. I can't leave it alone. There's actually a growing movement for residential treatment for teens that are addicted to their screens. About 25% of kids say that they have experienced cyberbullying. Many of them say they would change their online behavior if parents were if you can't say something nice, then just be quiet. And one of the messages right at the end of 13 Reasons Why, which is a good idea, but a little too simplistic, is we just all need to be kinder. And we do need to be kinder with all of the things that we post and use that incredible technology for. The research is saying kids are more connected than ever before, but they're more isolated than ever before. Good news for adults, kids are going out less, they're having less sex, they're using drugs less, but yet somehow they're more unhappy because they're isolated at home with their devices. And Karen mentioned a really interesting point in the beginning. Many schools are a little bit paralyzed in thinking, well, this isn't really our role. Sometimes we're a little bit hesitant, and I truly believe that cyberbullying needs to be in our handbook, and we need to go over it with students and parents. And of course, when I mentioned the tragedy of David Molak, David's legacy pushed legislation in Texas, where he lived, that makes cyberbullying a crime. And I believe 12 states now include cyberbullying in state legislation for schools, and Ohio is one of them. Isn't it really the parents' problem? Well, certainly. Parents need very much to be involved. Sometimes I like to ask school personnel, okay, tell me the truth. Why do you hesitate before you call the parents of the bully? They think about it, and then finally they'll say, well, I'm thinking the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. They're going to yell at me. They are not going to receive this news very well, but that's no excuse. We have to contact the parents of the bully. There's a lot of drama on Monday mornings, especially in middle schools, based on social networks and what kind of things were posted over the weekend. Students play an incredible role in prevention. And at the simplest level, I'd like to ask all of you listening this question. Have you surveyed the students in your school? Have they asked about the prevalence of bullying? Do you know inside your school building not only how prevalent bullying is, but where are the most likely settings where the bullying occurs? Also, very important to survey your students about cyberbullying and the frequency as well. With my last school superintendent, I had arranged for a survey to be done for the students and staff at a particular middle school. He looked through all the questions, and I'll never forget what he said when he looked up. Scott, if we were to ask these questions, if we were to determine we had a problem in one of these areas, well, then we'd be held accountable to do something about it. I could not believe that response, but I can give you other examples. But shouldn't administration be smart enough to know we need to ask the kids? Let's find out what the problems are, and let's involve them in the solution through things like anti-bullying pledges, through things like safety meetings that get input from students and get their ideas on not only what would make school safer, but what could we do that would actually reduce the bullying in school and out of school. How much in-service time is all this going to take? Because I know that in-service time is precious. The other day, a teacher shared with me that, okay, I was going down a crowded hallway. I knew there was bullying going on over there. I knew a kid was upset, but I'm only one person. I've only got 5 minutes. How can I make this a teachable moment for those that are the bystanders, provide consequences to the bully, support the victim, and I'm only one person, and they talked about it for 10 minutes before the start of school. So this takes a lot of planning, and it's critically important because when you're the victim of bullying, whether it's at school or whether it was cyberbullying last night, you are not in an optimal frame of mind to learn. And that is what education is all about, is making sure kids are in a good frame of mind to take advantage of this wonderful English lesson this afternoon. I'm curious if you've heard of a documentary out there. It's called Screenagers. And the documentary says children spend on average 6.5 hours a day on their screens. And I can't believe that younger children could possibly spend that much time. Older children, yes, but we need a lot more data. And one of the things we could do, which would be a great project at a school, is ask kids at various developmental levels to record the amount of time they're on their screens, or parents could keep track. And in talking with a lot of families, I want to be honest, often the mom will say something like this: well, I am definitely for a screen-free evening meal, but it's my husband. He will simply not put down his screen. Gandhi actually had a great quote: what we do speaks so loudly to our children that when we try to talk to them, they cannot hear us. So reducing screen time in our families with the adults modeling only reasonable use of screens would be a very important place to start. As Karen mentioned, I have a long background in working in suicide prevention, and I'm very aware that sleep deprivation often leads to depression, and yes, can be a contributing factor to suicide. And obviously, sleep deprivation would greatly impact learning at school. Some research says something like this: 1/3 of all adolescent girls in this country wake up in the middle of the night to see who has posted what about them on social media. I'm really sorry to tell you, many teenagers are sleeping with the phone underneath their pillow. So I made this simple point with parents near Atlanta, Georgia recently. Tell your teenagers it's 10:30, it's time to go to bed now. Give me your cell phone, your iPad, your laptop. I will have them in my room. They will be off and charged for you first thing in the morning. A mom came up to me. What if my 13-year-old daughter's friends needed to talk to her in the middle of the night? If I had her phone, then she wouldn't be able to respond to her friend. Mom, what's wrong with your daughter's friend actually talking to her own parents? And I guess if you have your daughter's phone and you want to answer it at 2:30 in the morning, go ahead. But you know, I didn't convince her. She walked away accepting this new world we live in and the idea that teens need to be available to their friends 24/7. I mentioned earlier residential treatment facilities being added because of the addictive nature of all of that screen time. And then less exercise, They're not developing social interaction. And one of the slides I could have put in this PowerPoint is kids playing outside today. It shows the kids on the front porch. They're all in chairs. They're all on their screens. And I'd like to ask everybody listening today, if it's a nice day after school, how many kids do you see outside riding a bicycle, shooting baskets, kicking a ball around, or maybe even just playing some simple neighborhood game? Unfortunately, screens have really taken over their lives. At the simplest level, in addition to no screens in bedrooms, I'd like to suggest no screens in cars. Do you know you could actually program your kid's phone so that it will not work in a moving vehicle? But now, these are the kind of tips that we could work into. Okay, hey, it's sophomore presentation for parents on the graduation plan. We could put a few minutes in there about the dangers of texting and driving. I like the phrase, do not be intoxicated. Now you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, they need all that navigational help. Well, yes, but you know, it could be set simply to talk to us as opposed to a screen that we're looking at as we drive down the road. And I understand that some of the executives of social networks have taken a stand restricting technology access to their own children. Kids don't have to be given a smartphone. They can be given a phone that all it does is make and receive calls. Don't be in a hurry. Take charge of the technology. And perhaps most importantly, we need to talk with kids about what is a reasonable plan for technology usage for you. What do you think is reasonable? I know we're not going to change things overnight, but let's get the input from the students themselves. And I'll be honest, I think phones at school should be banned or simply gathered up as the students enter the room and they can pick them up on their way out. So they'll have greater opportunity to actually take advantage of the lesson. And obviously I'm aware of the movement where a lot of the lessons are on iPads, of course, but we need to make sure we have clear rules and expectations. So let's look at an example from a middle school recently. 7th grade boy apparently threatened by the new kid at school who appears to be pretty good in basketball, texts all of his friends and says, send him the message, he is not welcome in our school, he's a loser, doesn't fit in, don't befriend him at all. The fallout. The new student's parents go to see you, the administrator, because all of a sudden their kid doesn't want to attend the new school. He finally admits he's being cyberbullied. They've got screenshots of these messages. What do you do? And I imagine everybody listening is realizing we got to roll up our sleeves. We got to get involved. We got to do some interviews. We got to do some conferences. There need to be consequences for the kids that are sending these messages. We need to have some dialogue with the parents of the kids that are doing the cyberbullying. And in terms of conferencing with parents, there's a little simple way that I like to begin every conference, regardless of the reason for the meeting, whether it's with the kid, whether it's with the parent, whether it's with the teacher. I like to get information first. I'm always going to be asking parents about their child, beginning with their child's strengths, asking them how they think things are going. Are there any things they're concerned about? I want to receive that information first. Then I'm going to give some information. Then hopefully we merge and we make a plan where we all agree on what we're doing. And at school, have you ever gone to a meeting and that meeting went on so long, you couldn't wait to get out of that meeting? And as you're heading down the hallway, you go, wait a minute, I don't even know what we decided. I don't even care. I just want out of that meeting. We need to be clear with everybody. Here's the plan. This is what we agreed on. Here's what each person is going to do. Here's how we're checking. So consequences for that bully are absolutely essential. So I said every state has anti-bullying legislation for schools. That's great. We need to make sure that it's not just on paper, that it actually means something. And of course, in many schools, the requirements are, you think bullying is involved, you must investigate, you must write it up, and your summary leaves your building. And unfortunately, sometimes this results in people not wanting to investigate because that is going to take time, it's going to be work, and it's going to be leaving our building. And I think we have to recognize bullying goes on in every school in America, and we shouldn't feel like we're going to be penalized because we're getting involved in trying to do something. We should be criticized when we're not doing anything. Ohio does include electronic means of bullying in the legislation. And in preparing for this webinar, I was very intrigued by two bills that were passed. I'm sorry, the word is not passed. Two bills that were proposed in the fall of 2017. Tiered discipline for aggravated bullying and proposing a suspension for first-time bullying offenses and then counseling before return to school. Now, that legislation on either Senate Bill 196 or House Bill 360 is not passed as yet, but the legislature is still looking at those particular bills. And I'm going to be honest in saying, as a psychologist, I don't want to start with suspension. I want interventions. I want consequences, but rarely do I see a kid who's removed from school come back with a better attitude. Some of the myths about bullying. They seek power because they're powerless. They're often very calculating. They get what they want. Bullying often results in at least some level of popularity. The idea that bullies were all previously abused. Long-term studies show that the children who are the bullying victims are more likely to have a history of abuse. And as I stated earlier, it's certainly not a problem just for the schools. It takes everybody. When bullied, it's best to fight back. I still encounter parents that encourage their children to fight back physically. And everybody listening knows that only makes things worse. There's going to be consequences if you strike back. And do bullies outgrow the behavior? Boy, I wish I could tell you they did. Unfortunately, it's a pattern they may carry into adulthood. And I think we'd all have to recognize, unfortunately, bullying does take place in the workplace as well. Here are the signs of being cyberbullied, and these are actually pretty straightforward. And yes, we do need to be concerned about a kid who doesn't want to come to school, or a kid who's in the nurse's office with a lot of somatic complaints, or somebody who seems nervous or tense anytime we are asking about technology and cell phones and their online behavior. Here's that definition. And by the way, Oveus is the big guy from Norway. He got involved in bullying prevention after a number of middle schoolers who were the victims of bullying died by suicide in Norway. And I certainly support his program, but it's pretty expensive. And the research says it tends to work a lot better in Norway than it does here in the United States. And at the simplest level, it takes a village. I'd like to see every school simply form a task force. Let's get some teachers, administrators, counselors, parents. Let's start working on bullying and cyberbullying prevention here at our school, and let's figure out exactly how we can get our students more involved. I'd be remiss today, especially since I opened with that People magazine headline, not to give you clear direction and a summary of the research about bullying and suicide. Causation, no. Strong association, yes. And that association is the strongest for LGBT youth. And when we have kids that have anxiety, internalizing issues, they have low self-esteem, they're kids that are very likely to be depressed. They're also very likely to be the victim of bullying. So SPRC, Suicide Prevention Resource Center, summarized 40 research studies. Strong association, causation, which is exactly what the People magazine news story implied. We can't prove causation. We cannot rule out all the other factors. The important relationship between adverse childhood experiences like neglect, abuse, living in poverty, living with a mentally ill or a substance abusing family member. All these things we don't want kids to have. How can we rule it out? How could we rule out mental illness? I've been involved in a number of lawsuits where schools were sued because parents believed the bullying their child received at school and the school was told about it. They didn't do anything about it. The parents on the lawsuits argued proximal cause to their death. One of those lawsuits went all the way to the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court, but Louisville ISD in Texas prevailed. Another lawsuit was against the Blue Springs, Missouri schools, and I was on their side. I don't believe they did anything wrong. However, they settled out of court for $500,000. A third lawsuit in Kentucky went all the way to the Kentucky Supreme Court. To date, no school district has ever been found liable in court for the suicide being the result of bullying and the school at fault for something that they failed to take sufficient action to do something about. How can we help a student who is bullying others? Here are the consequences today. I am not keeping this a secret. All the staff will be watching and paying attention. And if these consequences, they will escalate. The consequences escalate if this bullying continues. Hold them accountable. There are no excuses. By the way, one of our biggest mistakes as adults is when we tell two kids, you work this out. Bullying is about power. One kid has all the power, the other kid hardly has any. So they can't work it out on their own. And school districts have also been criticized for what is called a peace table, where you ask two kids to go over there and work it out. They could only really, the key point here is they need adults involved. And frankly, bringing the bully and the victim together isn't really very helpful. And with the bully, we got to look at some of the reasons for their behavior. And if I were to go back quickly, SPRC said strongest association, besides for the LGBTQ youth, are for what are called victim perpetrators. Well, what do I mean by that? They're the victim in some situations, but they're the perpetrator in others. So very important that we realize the association between bullying and suicide. But let me repeat again, we're never going to be able to show a causal relationship. So how can we help the kid who is bullying others? That's exactly what we're looking at now. And they may need a referral for mental health treatment. They do, in fact, need to have parents involved in a conference. And with parents, school personnel like the term the sandwich approach. So rather than starting with everything that your kid is doing wrong, what can we open with here after we've received information? What can we talk about that's positive? Now, let's talk about the things that really must be improved, and hopefully we can end with something that's a little more positive so the parents don't get defensive. And how do we stress to them that we're not blaming you as a parent? And I know nobody would ever say, this is your fault, you're a lousy parent. Of course not. But we might communicate that through our non-verbal behavior. How can we help this kid learn to develop empathy for others? Under close supervision, can we get them involved in pro-social activities? And can we reward them when they are engaged in appropriate behavior? So we've got to have a response for those that are bullying others. Bystanders. You know, I actually don't like that term. Would you agree with me, the term bystander? That's a pretty passive term. That means you stand by and you do nothing. Now, I know that it's going to take a lot of work for kids to actually step forward and say, we don't want that here, we don't like bullying. But we know that bystanders that are present about 80% of the time, they do have opportunities to intervene, but if they can't step forward that moment, they could certainly provide some support to the victim later, like, you don't deserve that. I'm sorry I didn't do anything. But let's see if we can get staff involved and we can do something about this. Or let's see if we can get parents involved when it's that cyberbullying occurring away from school. Or let's go in and talk to the counselor about it tomorrow, because I'm sorry you're being treated that way online. One of my students did her doctoral work on bystanders and cyberbullying. And not surprisingly, it's like the more people that are involved, the less likely it is that anybody will actually take any kind of stand against the cyberbullying. Cyberbullies also cause anxiety for all of the online bystanders. And I mentioned I don't really like that word. I like this movement that we call somebody a witness. You were a witness to the online bullying. You were a witness to the bullying in the hallway. When we use that term, it seems to imply the expectation of try to do something, at least a small step to support the victim and try to reduce the bullying. And programs that include bystanders as a big part in changing their attitude and behavior have been found to be the most effective. Why don't they get involved? Why don't they see themselves more as the witness I am describing? They're not sure what to do. They're afraid of retaliation. They're afraid they might become the target, or they might be ostracized by a group that they want to be seen as in with. They're concerned it might only get worse if I try to do something, and I don't think the adults can do anything about it. Some people have said, oh, come on, Scott, everybody gets bullied. It's a rite of passage. It's just a part of growing up. But it doesn't have to be. And more we understand that bullying does take its toll, perhaps for as long as decades, on anxiety and self-esteem. So what am I specifically recommending? First of all, we got to talk to all the kids in our school about cyberbullying and prevention. We need to take immediate action. The action is pretty straightforward in terms of it is not acceptable. Consequences, conferences, and if the cyberbullying actually resulted in a threat of bodily harm, well, we need some police involved. And I was in a meeting yesterday with school personnel, and the SROs spoke up about they want to be more involved, and they would be an excellent resource when an administrator or a counselor is investigating cyberbullying. I mentioned earlier, getting the kids together is not the answer. Let the bully know we are taking these steps today. We are watching. The consequences will escalate. Try to help the bullying victim understand we're on their side. You don't deserve this. And please let us know if this continues. I talked a little bit earlier about student involvement and how very important that is. I like this term, digital citizenship. How do we teach kids in our homes and in our schools what's appropriate, what's not appropriate for online and social networks? And I think we'd have to all acknowledge that if we are a little impulsive, we might quickly type out something, whether it's a message back to somebody via email, whether it's something we're thinking about posting, or whether we think something is sort of funny and we want to forward it to somebody else. But the more we can just stop and think and look carefully at what we just typed before we post it or send it. And all schools need a means for anonymous reporting. Done a lot of work with schools in Colorado over the last 2 years. Colorado has an anonymous reporting line called Safe to Tell, which is heavily promoted for students all across Colorado. And I had a meeting on my last trip there with Susan Payne, the executive director of Safe to Tell. And I asked, what is the most frequent thing that is reported to Safe to Tell? It's bullying. And we need to have something like this for students to report in every state in our country. So this is about digital citizenship. These are the things that the digital citizenship promotes and how important it is to recognize we're setting up essentially our digital footprint. We need to think about that. And the things that we post, they're pretty much there forever. And they say a lot about us as a person. And let's think through that carefully. So, ideas from Common Sense Media about who to communicate with, who not to communicate with, appropriate and safe websites, keeping things private, like our passwords, of course. And it's almost like when do we start all of this? And I think it has to start very, very early with kids, even before they go to school, and be reinforced in kindergarten, first grade, all the way through every level of school grades. The power of words. And was what I said, did I really mean that? Could it have been basically interpreted in a very nasty way? And we have to prepare all of our students for the idea there are people that are just trolling online. They are just looking for a way in or an opportunity to be mean to someone. Are you all familiar with the Megan Meyer Foundation? And Meyer is spelled M-E-I-R. I think you probably are. I did a webinar with Tina Meyer. And basically, that was the MySpace case. And of course, I know MySpace is so old news, but about a decade ago, that's what kids were using. So sadly, Megan Meyer died by suicide. Megan Meyer was an example of a kid with some of the issues I've talked about earlier in terms of anxiety and low self-esteem. But Megan Meyer was befriended online by a boy, or at least she thought it was a boy, and the boy built her up, and she was so eager to meet this boy who was saying such nice things to her. And then everything turned mean and cruel, and Megan Meyer was encouraged to kill herself. And when her mom was gone, only to take her brother to the dentist, Megan hung herself. And by the way, you'll be shocked to know it wasn't a boy at all. It was a mom of another teenager who lived down the street who was posing as a boy who built Megan up and then turned everything to be mean and cruel. By the way, the judge who presided on the case said something like, "I'm sorry, we don't really have laws that cover this." So I encourage everybody to visit Common Sense Media, excellent resource. But hey, what if your child is the cyber bully? Take it seriously. Don't be defensive. Work with school personnel when they contact you. They sincerely care about your child. No, they do not have it in for your child. Clear and consistent expectations. And it's sort of a no-brainer that you're going to increase your supervision of your child online behavior. And yes, I would argue, take it away for a while and then slowly reintroduce it with great supervision. Don't be defensive. Work with the school. What if my child is the victim of cyberbullying? And by the way, often the parent's first idea is take away the technology. Well, that is actually punishing your child. Screenshots, document, work with the school. Or if this is a child that your kid knows through, maybe it's YMCA sports, maybe it's after school, work with whoever is in charge of those programs. Empathize with them. Not your fault. I'm going to be there for you every step of the way. Should you contact the parents of the kid that is cyberbullying your child? I'm going to recommend no. Here in Florida, I'm aware of where the dad jumped on the school bus, confronted the cyberbully. Dad got arrested. In a workshop recently, the parent said, "I'm a counselor. This is happening to my kid now. Believe me, I can approach the parents of the cyberbully in a calm way." And I'm saying, I don't think so. This is your kid. Work with school authorities, it's going to be very difficult for you to stay calm and use your counseling skills. So you see that last phrase, do not contact the parents of the bully. Start with the kid's teachers. Ask the teacher to involve other school staff, like school psychologists, counselors, and social workers. If the teacher's response is not what you were expecting, now you need to talk with the administration. Commit to you are going to get this stopped. You're going to talk regularly with your child about this. Most importantly, be there to listen to your child and keep the school staff apprised of a problem if it's continuing. And then we all want to know, how do we help our students be a little bit more resistant to bullying? And the whole concept is every kid needs to find their niche. What do I mean by that? Where is it that they're treated well? What activity is it where they're actually pretty good at it? I don't care if it's violin, band, robotics, chess, or football. Put kids in a situation where they're treated well and encourage them to build friendships. Do you know, sometimes it just takes one good friend who's on your side, and teach them how to seek adult help and how to avoid situations where the bullying is most likely to occur. And we need our homes and our schools to be welcoming places, an environment where kids feel safe. And I know we just had a school shooting yesterday in Kentucky, and I'm saddened by that because I've actually been a responder to 15 different school shootings. But I love this statement. We need to make our schools welcoming, safe places where every kid feels connected, where a kid would never think about being violent or shooting others, because we want every kid to feel welcome, safe, and to have strong connections with everybody at school. And a simple activity that I asked a school crowd yesterday is this one. In every classroom, I like to ask kids, who's your go-to adult at school? Who would you go to if someone was really bad, if somebody was bullying others, or you were feeling really bad, or if you knew somebody who was thinking about bringing a gun to school, or somebody who was thinking they didn't want to live anymore? Who's your go-to adult at school? Who's your go-to adult in the community? And of course, I'm the most concerned when there are not go-to adults. These protective factors, you can glance at those. I want to go over some questions, so I want to leave time for those, but these come from the World Health Organization. This is what every kid around the planet needs in terms of connections, coping, problem-solving skills, stable families, to be treated well in our families, access to mental health treatment, and go-to adults besides their parents. So a big part of the concept today is we've got to work on teaching kids to be responsible. And at the simplest level, I hope everybody would realize there's an association between bullying and suicide, and we should never hesitate to ask a kid we know is the victim of bullying about thoughts of hopelessness and thoughts of suicide. And for our parents, we need to say clearly, your kid can't be your technology guru. You've got to stay up with this. You've got to know and recognize mean behaviors. And in our schools, we've got these incredibly technology skilled people in charge of like OIT. We need to have letters and information to parents and newsletters so they can keep up with the latest social networks. We need to include information and presentation for parents about what to look for and what to do. And here are the resources. And I'm going to turn it back to Karen to see what questions you have for me. So Karen, do we have any questions?
Yes, sorry, Scott. I thought I was actively being listened to. We did have a couple of questions that came in. One of them is a little bit lengthy, but it seems like a very important one. Do you have any suggestions for handling cyberbullying over the Snapchat function in particular? I've had incidents come up in which students report cyberbullying, but because the images disappear on Snapchat, there's no way for us to see them and determine what is really happening. In one situation, it was reported that a student had sent a photo of her holding a knife up to her neck and threatening suicide. It was a difficult situation to handle because we weren't sure of what was actually sent or who was involved in this messaging. Any thoughts there, Scott?
Well, that's incredibly challenging, and obviously as an older adult, I don't like the idea that it disappears, and I just think we have to have a conference with all the kids involved, and if a kid tells me he saw it and then it disappeared, that's enough for me. I'm going to take some action with the students and with the parents.
Okay, another one that came in. What would be your suggestion as a consequence to present to administrators or school personnel who currently use suspension as the consequence?
They currently use what is they use suspension. Okay.
Correct.
So, well, I much prefer the old school in the building suspension. I prefer that to out of school. When a kid's out of school, we don't know anything about the supervision. They tend to come back with a bad attitude. They didn't do the work we needed them to do. And in my previous job, we actually wrote a grant, so we were able to obtain counselor positions for the kids that were in the building or in school suspension. And what we were the most concerned about was when a kid's now in in-school suspension for the second or third time, they need to be talking to a counselor or psychologist, and we need to be looking at some of the decisions they're making. So I'd like to create in the building suspension or after school detentions. I see both of those as preferable consequences to out of school.
Okay, there are two questions that came in that are more about logistics. One of them said, is there a way to print the slides? I'll explain in a minute, but we're going to be posting all of this on the PSI website. It's in a PDF format, so you will be able to download and print the slides. And there was another question about showing the resource page again. Once again, very soon we will have this posted. Well, he's showing it anyway. Thanks, Scott. But this will also be posted on the PSI website, so you can refer to it later. I do want to go over a few logistics. We really hope you found this useful and that you'll participate in future PSI webinars. If you have any additional information on any PSI website service, either look there, or Scott, can you go to the very last slide? It has our website there. One more. Thank you. Just know that once the webinar ends, you will then see a survey. If you're interested in receiving a certificate for a contact hour, you must complete the survey and give us about a week or so. You will, via email, receive your certificate for one contact hour. So on behalf of everyone here, we'd like to thank Dr. Scott Poland so much and thank all of you for participating in this webinar.